A funny thing happened when singer-songwriter Ben Folds recorded a version of his hit track Rockin The Suburbs for the 2006 animated film Over the Hedge's soundtrack. He changed all the lyrics. Gone is the obscenity, the edginess, along with most of the original subject matter. The rough edges get sanded right down. And it works so much better as a result. Hear me out. The song, originally released in April 2001, was a minor hit, a comedy rock track satirizing the overly angsty nu metal / butt rock of the period.
Let me tell y'all what it's like, being male, middle class and white.
In it, Folds spoofs the fury, the rage that the often white, often male bands of the day tended to build their songs around. The joke is in the way Folds' track contrasts this angst with the cushy lifestyle and material comforts that middle-class suburbanites behind that genre enjoyed. That's the idea, anyway. And so we have lines like those of the second stanza. I got shit running through my brain, it's so intense that I can't explain. All alone in my white boy pain, shake your booty while the band complains. Interesting enough, right? Catchy too. Though, listening to the track, watching the video, there is this nagging feeling of discomfort. During interviews at the time, Folds identified Korn and Rage Against the Machine, undoubtedly both angsty white boy favorites of the time, as prime examples of the scene his track was responding to. And those two targets are evident enough in the song's rage channeling coda and the video's Freak on a Leash parody. But Rage Against the Machine? That's not really a white boy band, is it? They didn't get their start in the suburbs either. And I think it's fair to say that the angst of their music is pretty reasonable given some of the subject matters.
Some of those that work forces are the same that burn crosses.
Korn? Sure, Jonathan Davis fits the white suburban background a bit better, but he didn't really have it that easy either. He'd had a messy family life since he was an infant, he'd endured brutal bullying at school and at home, as well as being abused by a trusted figure and having his family refuse to believe him. Now, I don't know the guy, but it does seem like his is the story of a childhood made hellish in part by attempts to play at happy families, by the collective enforcement in public and in private of that particular rigidly conformist mindset unique to, or at least epitomized by, suburbia. Don't get me wrong, the shoe still mostly fits. Rockin The Suburbs is responding to a phenomenon greater than any two bands, and Folds' song is directed just as much to the angry listener as it is to the angry musician, but the rub remains, at least a little. Maybe life can suck behind a white picket fence too. Maybe there are types of sucking unique to suburbia. Maybe, conceptually, Rockin The Suburbs isn't the home run it once seemed. But, and yeah, here's the interesting part, practically all of that is gone in the soundtrack version. Here, look at the lyrics. I'll highlight all the lines that Folds kept the same. That is quite the change. Sure, that's partly because the original's a touch too explicit for a film aimed at children, but there's cleaning up a song, and then there's doing this, rewriting a lyric to the point where practically it is just a different song. There are two tracks here then, united by melody, instrumentation, a title, and a loose focus on the travails of suburban life. Well, no, there are more than two tracks. The basic plot of Over the Hedge is a fairly simple one. We follow RJ, a raccoon, as he deceives a community of hibernating animals into raiding the nearby suburban neighborhood that sprung up over winter for food. They think he's leading them in this caper as a shortcut, as a way to avoid the long, hard work of foraging their lifestyle had required before, but in reality, RJ's having them gather all this human food to repay a bear, whose own processed stash he'd first tried to steal and then inadvertently destroyed. All the while, the hibernator's de facto head of household, Vern, suspects foul play, and tries to convince the foragers to abandon RJ's newfangled food hunting practices and figure out the raccoon's game. Wait, did I say it's a fairly simple one? Yeah, maybe it isn't. For a kids film, there's quite a lot going on there, especially when the Type A Homeowners Association president, the vicious exterminator, and that aforementioned bear get thrown into the mix. There's a lot to think about. So you know what? Let's simplify, go back to the start. Who are our players, and how are we introduced to them? The first time we see an animal, it's the starving RJ, searching for food in a land bisected by asphalt. The only thing he finds is a single packet of crisps that remains just out of reach. The first forest dweller we see is Vern, bolting out from his now barren hibernation station, ready to begin the yearly cycle anew. The first time we see a human?
Oh, no, I can talk, I'm just driving.
But of course, the human we see isn't just a human. Hers is not an abstract humanity, it's a specific humanity. She's not a post-apocalyptic wanderer, she's not, I don't know, a medieval German washerwoman. No, she's a 21st century American suburbanite. And that's important, that's really important. The film's a clash of philosophies, of worldviews, but what are those worldviews? This isn't just animals versus humans, not even the natural versus the civilized. It's hibernators versus suburbs. The former lead simple, if not easy, lives, working the year round to forage for the fruits of their forest environment, preparing a stash to see them through to the next spring, at which point the pattern repeats. Existence for the hibernator is cyclical, and that cycle moves with the natural rhythm of the forest. Gathering, stockpiling, consumption, growth, fall, freeze, regrowth. A sustainable mode of existence like this, in touch with nature, isn't necessarily a non-human one. People have lived a great many different ways over the years. Some of those don't look so different from the way Vern and co live. But yeah, some do. Maybe none more so than this one, the American suburb. And I don't think it'd be controversial to say that the picture over the hedge paints of this suburbia, of the particular mentality and lifestyle this suburbia creates and requires, let's call that suburbanity, and the critique it levies in response, these are the film's most sophisticated and most successful elements. In Over the Hedge, suburbia is a place of emptiness, a land that glitters but has no gold. We can look here to Vern's first encounter, after he slips through the hedge. A dog that isn't a dog. Something with the appearance of life, but which bizarrely, distressingly, possesses none. But it's not just the dog. Before we even properly see suburbia, before the rest of the cast goes over the hedge, before we have our tour, when all we have to go on is Vern's confused brush beyond, the film has already cast it as a fallen place, a land of sin, and a stolen land of sin at that. Because our real introduction to suburbia, our introduction not to the phenomena of suburbia but to the idea of suburbia, comes from RJ, and is presented to us in consciously lapsarian terms.
It's called a hedge. And it is not to be feared, my amphibious friend. It is the gateway to the good life.
I mean, look at the scene. Our setting a garden, and within it a familiar-feeling temptation game plays out. We have the silver-tongued RJ as our charismatic Miltonian Satan figure, Hammy the squirrel as Eve, a packet of crisps for the forbidden fruit.
I understand. This is something that you're just not open to.
What is that?
And if the unspoiled woodland is Eden, suburbia is the land of Nod. There is a deeper resonance to this scene's biblical flavoring besides suburbs bad though. The woods have only become a garden-like space because the waspy suburban realm has expanded, bounded the American wild, consciously drawing on those old-world cultural ancestors while doing so, El Rancho Camelot, and the figuring of that American landscape as Edenic is a symbolic move with a richly colonial history. When the colonists and explorers wrote of the American country, they often did so with the same lapsarian points of reference we can glimpse in Over the Hedge. But, of course, to figure the land of pre-colonial America as some untouched Eden is to erase the people living there, the people who, in many cases, were responsible for those ideal environmental conditions. Here then, suburban sprawl is sort of loaded up with the weight of broken promises and displacement, and not just the kind you tend to hear linked with it most often. The history of suburban expansion is the history of redlining, is the history of white flight, but it is also a continuation of that manifest destiny spirit. The racism, the land theft here, the disregard for the life and lifeways before the bulldozer is inexorably present, and we do get a sense of that here. Over the Hedge's ironic repeating of that gesture establishes how the film will approach the suburb, as an inherently violent, senseless space, a place whose appeal, whose aesthetic success, hides a destructive reality. That destruction looms most obviously above the hibernators. Again, this vast, encircling suburban development is not necessarily a finished project. What was that? Anyway, but the suburban destructiveness also threatens humanity, even if it does so less obviously. As the film is well aware, suburbia is a place of tremendous waste, material, electrical, even economic. Suburbs, at least in their typical configuration, in this configuration, are practically a Ponzi scheme, all but bankrupt the cities they spring up around and offer only further expansion, further debt, further car dependency, and further ecological devastation as solutions. For more on this whole thing, why not rewatch this Not Just Bikes video that statistically you've all already seen? There's also the fact that this expansion, this growth, cannot be infinite, and obviously the film knows this too. The basic premise of Over the Hedge is an anticipation of that inevitable moment of final enclosure, where the last acres of nature are finally encircled.
It never ends!
Whoa! Hey!
It never ends that way, too.
Of course, here that enclosure is partially symbolic. Theoretically, there is more wilderness somewhere off-screen, but at least within the world we're shown, there's no reason what's happening here won't eventually happen there too. I mean, think back to the only other semi-natural scene we've seen, the opening highway, bereft of food save for human scraps. The Hibernator's Wood then stands in for the natural world as a whole, El Rancho Camelot, the suburb, for all growth-oriented human development, for the same car-centric late capitalism we've watched gobble up more and more of our environment in the 18 years since the film's release. We know how that's going to end. And that's not even hindsight talking. Other animated films, kids' animated films of this era knew this too. In terms of the grand historical economic dynamics at the heart of both films, Over the Hedge may as well be a Wall-E prequel. But, and here's the kicker, that destruction, that damage, it's not all implied. It's not just the loose suggestion of some future doom. No, the other thing Over the Hedge shows us here, maybe the main thing Over the Hedge shows us here, is that this suburbanity is already playing havoc with its inhabitants. Here then, united by melody, instrumentation, a title, and a loose focus on the travails of suburban life. Well, no, there are more than 2 tracks here, because Folds didn't just re-record Rockin The Suburbs, he contributed a handful of others to the film's soundtrack. Some were originals, Billie Eilish even covered one of them, there's your fun fact for the video, but the other closing credits cut, which plays alongside that Rockin The Suburbs redo to close out the picture, was a cover of Lost in the Supermarket, originally by The Clash.
I'm all lost in the supermarket. I can no longer shop happily.
The speaker of Lost in the Supermarket tells us they weren't born so much as they fell out. Theirs is an utterly typical life. They see all the programs, save all the coupons, buy all the hit albums, they know that's what they're supposed to do, but it doesn't make them feel good. It just makes them feel even more lonely. The nearest they get to feeling otherwise is hearing the noises of kids and telephones echo through their neighborhood, or when they turn to the bottle. The speaker tells us this, then starts to repeat. The song doesn't even seem to realize when it's over. The chorus circles back again and again as the band disintegrates around it, like a shopper wandering endlessly through a maze of aisles, disoriented by the glare of the lights, and the deals, and the products, and the voices on the tannoy seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Another couplet from the opening verse is telling. We had a hedge back home in the suburbs, over which I never could see. So this is a track with a lot more sympathy for the plight of the suburbanite, imagined here as a rightfully disillusioned orphan of consumerism, someone who perceives a problem but can't solve it or even articulate its nature. It's a track that sees, that shows how small that white picket fence identikit existence can be. The speaker is a pathetic figure, but we don't blame them, we pity them instead. Above all, it's a track where the suburbs look different to how they did in Folds' song. Or at least, to how they did in version 1. Because The suburbia Over the Hedge gives us is a land of plenty. It seems neat and peaceful. You'd really think, especially seeing this comfort after the relative animal hardship we opened with, that the suburbanites would feel that comfort, would be happy. But they aren't. The suburbanites we see are rarely smiling. They snipe at each other, and they become frightened and violent upon so much as seeing an animal in the space that was, until very recently, that animal's habitat. And it is worth noting that this suburban discontent predates any of that hibernator food war skirmishing. We see Homeowners Association President Gladys being a terror before she's met RJ, Vern, and the gang.
The homeowner's charter, which you signed, says the grass is supposed to be 2 inches, and according to my measuring stick, yours is 2.5.
Gladys's role in Over the Hedge is an important one beyond this, though. Because of the things she does, sure, but also because of the things she doesn't do. Gladys never marvels at the neighborhood's beauty and uniformity. She never enjoys her material comfort. Her satisfaction seems to come from the knowledge that if she wanted to, she could. She doesn't, but who would know that without the privileged voyeuristic insight into her life the viewer receives via the hibernators? It's not about the order, the plenty, the peace. It's about preserving the credibility of suburbia, of the idea these perfections, in theory, come together to create. Gladys's motivation seems to be the phenomenon Slavoj Žižek called the objective status of belief, the idea that interiority kind of doesn't matter, that it's irrelevant whether upholding the suburban ideal is making her and everyone else miserable, so long as they can be seen by an imagined, naive observer to be at peace, to be living the perfect life promised by the myths of suburbanity. To borrow a term from the philosopher Robert Pfaller, Gladys and the suburbanites only ever experience that perfection interpassively. They live as if it's true. Suburbia is a spell they're all casting together. So it's not just that the Camelot development's inhabitants aren't happy with their ostensibly cozy existence, it's that they're barely experiencing that existence to begin with. Life is mediated for Over the Hedge's suburbanites. That's the other thing, besides the general bad vibes, that unites them. All their food and drink is hyper-processed. To travel is to drive around in massive tank-like cars. To hire an exterminator isn't to speak to one, isn't even to call one up. It's to request a middleman aggregate business listings for you.
I need every business listing you have under exterminator.
Consider the lyrics of Heist, the track that plays over this first food theft montage. As usual, Folds sings of suburbia, but here it's a realm where pink flamingos crow, diet soda flows, what you take magically regenerates, and the ovens clean themselves. We hear the magical conveniences of suburbia experienced unquestioned, lawn ornaments that are what they imitate, fizzy pop as water, and so on. Now initially we seem to be inhabiting a perspective like that of one of the film's hibernators, seeing suburbia for the first time, but the animals never shop, never concern themselves with cleaning either. Those are human concerns, so the fit is hardly perfect here. No, the point of Heist is to blur those lines, to suggest that the naivete of these animals isn't so far removed from that of suburbia's human inhabitants. So long as you don't see the after-hours restocking, the supermarket shelves may as well magically replenish. So long as you ignore the maid, the oven does clean itself. For its suburbanites, Over the Hedges is a world where the neighborhood's land didn't exist before the houses went up, where crisps aren't grown and chopped and cooked and packaged but simply materialize, where people aren't a community, a society even, but are atomized individuals. Origin and destination, cause and effect have become so detached, the processes of life have become so thoroughly mystified, that Gladys can call for the hibernators to be killed before they get hurt with a straight face.
This is exactly why I called the exterminator, to kill them before they get hurt like this.
That the installation of the brutal and illegal depelter unit can be a mercy.
I don't care if this thing's against the Geneva Conventions. I want it!
I thought you might. So I took the liberty of installing it for you.
Looking at the film's human cast, the only real exception to this atmosphere of indirectness is Dwayne, the exterminator, and significantly, he is an external figure. He doesn't live in the suburb. He had to be called in. So the suburbanites don't experience things directly, and they don't experience their environment directly either. I'm not just talking about the way the land itself was subjugated and homogenized to permit their inhabiting of it, the way that the suburbanites haven't moved into the hibernator's habitat so much as they have interposed an already familiar layer between that habitat and themselves. No, I'm also thinking about their cars. One artifact Pfaller considers in his book, Interpassivity, The Aesthetics of Delegated Enjoyment, is the SUV. For Pfaller, the rough and ready car provides the sense of off-road without ever having to go there. The irony of the non-rural SUV driver is pushed even further in Over the Hedge, as we watch suburbanites tootling about in rugged Canyonero-type cars on flattened, domesticated land that until their arrival was wild. The sense of countryside living provides a mental wedge against direct recognition of their tarmacked, urbanizing reality, just as the sense of that idealized suburbanity provides one against recognizing the destruction of that very countryside that is so inherent to the suburban project. So for Over the Hedge, the suburbs aren't just a place of waste and of environmental destruction, they're also a place of hypocrisy, of a kind of false consciousness, and subsequently a place of barbarity, a place of both cruelty between humans and of cruelty projected outward. The leader of this Camelot, this shining palace of modernity, of civilization, becomes a bloodthirsty hunter as soon as she's faced with a slight inconvenience, with this place's pre-existing inhabitants having the gall to so much as show their furry little faces in what was, until recently, their home. The central irony in Over the Hedge's suburban portrait comes in the idea that the behavior and mentality preserving the illusion of the suburb required in figures like Gladys lays bare that it is just that, an illusion, a cruel one, an inauthentic one, an unsustainable one. Far from being the epitome of civilization, suburbanity is almost opposed to living, to life itself, and so it must be defeated. But how? It's a track where the suburbs look different to how they did in Folds' song, or at least to how they did in version 1. Because we almost see Lost in the Supermarket's suburbs again in the soundtrack version, the version that plays immediately before the Clash cover over the film's credits. In the Over the Hedge version, Rockin the Suburbs dispenses with the focus on supposedly insincere suburban angst, instead zooming in on that angst's setting.
We're rocking the suburbs, around the block just one more time.
We look past inhabitants to see practices, and stripped of that human camouflage, defamiliarized in that way, those practices are made shocking. We see waste in 40,000 watt nativity scenes. We see the shocking pace of urban sprawl in lines like "Everything we need is here, but it wasn't here last year." And in the moment Folds sings of a house built safe and sound on Indian burial grounds, we glimpse that expansion's inherent violence. We see updatings of the Clash's lost suburbanite, figures which can't quite remember which identical slice of individualism is theirs, and we see, above all, that the suburban project is kind of a scam. We drive our cars every day to and from work both ways, so we make just enough to pay to drive our cars to work each day. Hey. In the re-recording, suburbanites are no longer privileged ingrates, or rather no longer just privileged ingrates, but also people who live in a severely limited world, a world whose limits they sort of reinforce themselves without necessarily realizing. As Folds said himself in an interview a few years later, looking back at the effective angst he tried to satirize with Rockin the Suburbs, there's no excuse, but there is a reason. If version 1's focus was the no excuse, version 2's is the reason. Maybe the biggest signal of the track's pivot comes in William Shatner's spoken word interlude, where the ex-Trekker's apoplectic snooper character's petty rant all but manages to frame the sole textual refugees from that original lyric and overheard noisy rock band as genuinely subversive agents.
It wasn't me that dialed 911 at 6:31 p.m. Wednesday. How about your son's noisy rock band?
Folds' 2006 revision transforms the setting of Rockin the Suburbs from a plush and palatial one to a panopticon, houses upon houses of contradiction, all built on sand. Over the Hedge's suburbanity is defeated, but before that external defeat is possible, it must first be expunged from within our protagonists. Because just as our animals have penetrated Camelot, so too has Camelot penetrated our animals, and none more so than that first tempting presence. Earlier I likened RJ to Milton's Satan, but Satan was, of course, a fallen angel. Luckily though, Over the Hedge isn't Paradise Lost, or Genesis even, and RJ isn't Satan. RJ isn't even Eve. No, this is a world in which a fall is reversible, in which corruption can be cleansed, in which the sin of self-interested, short-sighted suburbanity can be shifted before it sets in for good. And that's precisely what happens at the film's climax. At the moment RJ completes his mission, reassembles and delivers Vincent the Bear's human food stash at the cost of his newfound hibernator community, at the moment RJ's feigned cooperation has allowed him to return to his solo sub-suburban scavenger lifestyle, the lifestyle he sees reflected in Vincent, he realizes that lifestyle is an empty one, and he makes his choice. In one motion, RJ destroys the food wagon and saves his new friends.
Trust me, you don't need them.
Actually, I do. And right now, they really need me. So I really need this! What the?
It's important to note that the alternative to this suburbanity RJ chooses isn't simply some return to monkey primitivism. Initially it might seem that way, that the Verne-led hibernators follow a staunch traditionalism, that RJ offers them an adaptation and evolution that the film ultimately rejects, but by the midpoint or so, it's clear that framing the struggle in these terms would be an oversimplification, because Verne changes.
I shouldn't have taken all that food. I was just being cautious. Because that's what I am. I'm naturally tentative. I think they're right. I think I'm just jealous.
You're just trying to do what's best for your family.
And I think you're what's best for them now.
The extreme caution, the resistance to new ways of doing things that had characterized them up to this point, were reasonable responses to a drastic change in environment, but now we see his mindset, their mindset, is flexible enough to adapt to the challenges and opportunities of that new environment. It seems otherwise narrow, regressive, because it's foreign to us, because we are more accustomed to the world of their opponents, but in fact it's wide-ranging. It isn't solely sustainability and directness, as opposed to suburbanity's short-sightedness and mediation. It's not that nothing else is allowed, it's anything so long as these two pillars are included, even, especially, adaptation. And we see this quite clearly, in fact, in the animal's final symbolic victory over the suburban. RJ and the Hibernators end up smashing Dwayne's van into Gladys's house, but they're not out of trouble quite yet. Both humans approach on one side and Vincent reappears on the other. The suburban on one side, the prospect of suburbanization against it. Our Hibernators only prevail after Hammy busts out an energy drink, inspires the best scenes of 2 X-Men movies, and reactivates the D-Pelter, which, through an invocation of that essential suburban insatiability,
with a spuddy, enough just isn't enough!
RJ is able to trick Vincent into triggering, brutally imprisoning all our antagonists in one fell swoop. In other words, the animals adapt and redirect the inhumanity of the suburban onto itself. In the aftermath, we see Gladys crumbling under the very structures she'd drawn her previous authority from. Now bedraggled and disoriented, her position as head of the Conformity Brigade dissolves to nothing. And even the premonition of a possible conviction, the as-if supplied by these policemen, is enough to destroy what remains of her.
I can't be arrested!
Excuse
I'm
me.
president of the Homeowners Association!
Dwayne, meanwhile, has his escape attempt foiled by Nugent the dog, one of 2 domesticated animals who come to align with our Hibernators over the final 20 or so minutes. The disconnected, solitary lifestyle they'd been living, the hand-me-down individuality these pets had inherited from their owners, is a disease, and across the course of the climax, they come to see this, the truth that Gladys, Vincent, and even the Clash's lost shopper could not. And all this is, of course, reinforced by the film's end proper, which sees the Hibernator's makeshift family itself changing, expanding to include RJ. The Suburban is beaten then in 2 steps, first rejected within, then defeated without. And the inner and outer victories alike result from our animals seeing the limitations of suburbanity, the contradictions, the brutality of its peacefulness, the loneliness of its community. They're uniquely positioned to see these, to channel them through to the viewer as refugees from the nowhere landscape that precedes Camelot, as walking denials of the tacit assumption suburbanites too often make of their environment's creation ex nihilo. This place existed before the roads were laid and the pipes were bolted in. It housed life before it housed houses, and our protagonists embody that fact. The Suburban is beaten. It's not destroyed, its figureheads may have been destroyed, but Camelot is still there, but it is held off, and it does become known. Vern's troupe know what they're up against now. They know it can be beaten, and they know how its artifacts, its geography, and most importantly its mindset can be used against it. Suburbanity is opposed to life itself, including, especially, its own. Looking in from the outside, from the real outside, from a hibernator's perspective, when you can see over that hedge, that all becomes clear. Say what you will about Over the Hedge then. The animation looks a little janky nowadays, Avril Lavigne's performance is a little shaky, maybe elements of the film are trash, but I think at the core of the movie lies a sustained, coherent, and relatively sophisticated critique of American-style suburbia and the assumptions and contradictions underpinning it as it existed in 2006. Or no, scratch that last part. Even as it looks now, this film, the ideas and practices it critiques, the way it does so through this perspectival defamiliarization, the way the familiar is made alien and terrible through the eyes of a woodland critter, all this has aged incredibly well, to the point I feel we're overdue for some sort of new urbanist online reclamation of this film. But I think that's about that, so thanks everyone for viewing, thanks to MKevs for suggesting this topic, and thanks to the rest of my Patreon and YouTube support. Huh, whoever could that be? Who are you? I'm you, from the future. The video's not over yet. You think it is, but it isn't. You tie it up, you publish it, people generally like it, you move on. And then, years later, we rewatch Over the Hedge, and we see it. The rub, the wrinkle, the thing we didn't talk about, the thing no one talks about. What about the pamphlet, Pog? What about the pamphlet? So, early on in the film, as Vern and the gang are getting to grips with their new environment for the first time, we see a pamphlet visualizing the scale of the development. In terms of the moment's tone, in terms of the place this moment occupies in between more narratively important beats, and in terms of how long we spend with the pamphlet, this would seem to be an utterly minor detail. But look at the pamphlet and tell me this isn't the single most important shot of the movie. The pamphlet tells us 2 incredibly weighty facts. 1, that even the remaining woodland is earmarked for future development, and 2, that even in the meantime, the area of the remaining wilderness is tiny, problematically so. I called the woodland a garden earlier, but it literally is the size of a garden. Even before RJ joined up, before the gang got another mouth to feed, there's not going to be enough food to forage. This movie's resolution is betrayed utterly by a tiny detail that flashes on screen 1 hour earlier. The defeat of the suburbanites, RJ's adoption, all this is made hollow by the knowledge that at some point in the near future, the food will run out, the bulldozers will drive up, and their emaciated corpses will be paved over with cement. Or is it? After the villains are defeated, well after we've seen that pamphlet, as the film is wrapping up, as Vern laments all the gathering time they've wasted, Hammy mentions that while in Quicksilver mode, he'd found his lost stash of nuts.
I filled the log. Look! I found my nuts!
And yes, if we're being nitpicky, this doesn't solve our problem. Hammy's found the nuts he lost earlier.
I buried some nuts in the woods and I know where they are and I'll be right back, bye!
These aren't new nuts. There will not be enough new nuts after this. We are in a garden. After this winter, it's game over once more. But if we're not being nitpicky, come on, the film's doing a happy ending, right? Nuts Ex Machina wants to be taken straight. Nuts Ex Machina is a symbol for the tying up of loose ends. Food problems remain, suburbia remains, but there is hope, and there is a way forward, Nuts Ex Machina seems to say. It doesn't make a ton of sense, but this is a story. This is a kids' film. It can pull the idea of everything being fine, pamphlet be damned, out of thin air, so why wouldn't it? And if we go with it, if we look back at that climax with the spirit of Nuts Ex Machina in mind, there are ways to read the finale that make that pamphlet matter less, ways to make what we've seen conform to the spirit of that happy ending. Maybe there's even more weight to that symbolic defeat than we granted. Maybe all this unseemly, unsuburban disruption will put a pause on Camelot's expansion plans. Maybe the acts of Fern, RJ, and co will ripple outwards, destabilize those off-screen systems of endless growth. Or maybe all this will happen again. Another HOA president, another exterminator, another victory for the hibernators made marginally easier by the experience they gained here. Maybe they'll be able to hold back the bulldozers too when they come. Maybe even after the nuts run out, the gang will be able to develop a new, perhaps hybridized solution. Bark and trash. Maybe, in time, the Hedge becomes the limiter of the Suburban, where before it was its vanguard. But that is a lot of maybes, and to be honest, it kind of felt like cope as I was saying it. Not entirely, but a bit, right? There's rereading the finale, and then there's rewriting the finale, headcanoning it into something far more than what we're actually shown. So yes, by the end of the film, we are in a weird spot. Remembering the pamphlet, taking it at face value feels wrong, but so does hand-waving it away. And that's as far as we go. Happy ending or no, this is an ending. The movie wraps up with this wonderfully unsettling detail still forgotten about. Or maybe not forgotten about. Maybe just unresolved. A half-tucked away memento mori, a sword of Damocles dangling overhead, ready to maybe drop in some unspecified future, and maybe not. To me, it's this, the matter of the pamphlet and the way it kind of gets ignored by the film's end, that takes over The Hedge from a bad or good or great movie to a truly fascinating one. And I'm not about to convince you that this was always meant to be the point, that this wonderful sense of ambiguity here was intended. I don't know if that's the case, and frankly, I don't care. Intentionality is the least interesting question we could ask here. Either way, it unsettles the film. It acts as a dark cloud, hovering just on the peripheries of the viewer's vision, never quite solidifying, never providing an answer, just the lingering sense that there is a problem, one that resists being solved, being articulated even. The future isn't promised. Maybe a symbolic victory won't buy you survival, after all. Maybe suburbanity is strong enough or dumb enough to just ignore its own contradictions and plow recklessly on. I wasn't lying in the fake conclusion we did a few minutes back. I do think Over the Hedge's suburban satire worked great. But for my money, there are two things that nowadays stick out even further, give the film power and weight to the viewer of 2024. First, there is the pamphlet, the wrinkle, the dark cloud, the doom at the edge of this film's vision. Second, just as important, if not more so, there's the way the film's happy ending still just about stands its ground despite it all. In a way then, Over the Hedge exemplifies the split mentality any new urbanist, anyone opposed to the real-world suburbanity the film reflects, or the structures of capitalism and ecological destruction that suburbanity is enmeshed with, needs to adopt. The simultaneous acceptance of the grim realities we face, and of the fact that they can be faced, can be beaten together. Thank you for watching. I know this isn't the longest video in length I've done or even done this year, but oh boy, this one took months. And for anyone who didn't know, this video was March's Patreon community video. That means it was suggested by a Patreon supporter, this time MCavs, and selected for videohood by the rest of the gang. Also shout out to Boom, their comment here got me thinking about the film's soundtrack. Things are running a little behind with the Patreon schedule at present. Again, this was supposed to be March's video, but I'll ensure the May poll remains open for a little while after this video drops. So if you want to have your say for the next one of these, sign up below and go nuts. Squirrel joke. It also helps me out a whole bunch, so if you do, thanks so much. And same goes, of course, to everyone supporting me already, especially Hanan, Daniel Goldhorn, Magath, Something Capitalism Bad, Thomas R, and Weirdy Beardy.